Cloud.
Yes. All right, guys. Well, welcome to our workshop, The Power of Effective Note-Taking. My name's Kelly Alford, and I'm an academic coach at the Round Rock campus. And I'm going to let Jordan introduce himself, and then we'll get started.
Thank you, Kelly. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jordan. I'm an academic coach here at the San Gabriel campus at ACC, and I am excited to see so many faces here. Thank you guys for joining. We are thrilled to have you.
Absolutely. All right, so let's do just a quick housekeeping. So we are recording, so first things first, if you don't want to be on camera, go ahead and turn your camera off, keep muted. Definitely we want everybody to participate, so please engage with us. This workshop is for you guys, so feel free to ask questions, unmute if you want to drop a question in the chat. If we don't get to you, please make sure and stay at the end and let us ask us your question again. We'll try to make sure that we're catching everybody. And then if you get disconnected, don't worry about it. Try to reconnect. Jordan will let you back in, we promise. Even though we turn the sound off, he'll be watching to make sure you guys get back in. All right, so let's talk about this. Why do we need to improve our note-taking skills? Any thoughts? Anybody have any reason why you came to this workshop? Anybody want to just tell us why you want to improve your note-taking skills?
To help my retention.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Anybody else have another reason?
You study textbooks better.
Okay, awesome. All right, so we have retention, better studying of their textbooks. Anything else?
I've never been taught how to study, so I'd like to learn.
All right, excellent. All right, so let's talk about this. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So college is about your critical thinking. So it's going to be really important for you guys to make sure and improve your study habits. So we are definitely here to work with you to develop those critical thinking skills. And one of those areas that we can improve on is note taking. And so we definitely want to talk to you guys more about how to improve that moving forward. So we're going to do a quick activity, and then we'll move on to the actual fun part. All right, so we're going to show you a list of words for a few seconds, and I just want you to study this list of words. All right, let's flip to the next slide, Jordan. All right, so we didn't give you any prompt, but can somebody tell me how many vowels were in all of the words on that screen?
How many vowels?
Uh-huh.
Oh my God. Not a clue.
All right. Did anybody catch it?
No.
Can anybody think back?
16.
16. All right, we have a guess. I don't even know. It's been a while since I've done this activity. We can go back and look in a second, but let's talk about this. Why do you think we did that activity? What do you think that's kind of illustrating?
Memory.
Memory, okay.
What we thought was important wasn't necessarily what was important.
Exactly, right? So so the whole point of note taking, right, is to make sure that we are getting the most important information. But how do we know what's the most important information? So we want to talk about how to utilize some of these skills that we are going to talk about to better develop those skills, to make sure that your notes are more effective and more efficient. And we really want to make sure that as you're going through and you're working, we want to make sure that we are taking notes on the important stuff. We don't need to be taking notes on extraneous stuff or stuff that's not necessarily important. We want to make sure that we are taking the notes that are necessary and what we are going to need to know moving forward in our classes. So that being said, I'm going to let Jordan jump in here and talk to you guys a little bit about note taking.
All right, awesome. Yes, thank you, Kelly. And so, yes, so we will definitely talk a little bit about the types of note taking And first, I wanted to talk about the different types of note takers that there are. I think we can all now agree that note taking is very important. We need to be recording information. We need to note down the things that are important from the material. But like we see in this activity we just did, how do we know what's important? How do I know what kind of a note taker I am? And so I'm going to go over 3 different types or kind of characters of note taking that you might identify with. And then at the end, we're going to do a poll to see how you would identify. So let's first learn about 3 different types of note takers that they are. And so the first is somebody that takes no notes at all. And I put that one in red because obviously I think we can all agree that that one is probably bad to not take notes at all. And so that's somebody that maybe feels that they understand everything in class, so they don't need to take notes. I'm sure we've all felt like that at some point in some course, that I understand it. I don't need to write it down. I don't need to take notes, maybe even in high school. But of course, as you can see by this little note here, if you don't write it down, what are you going to remember? What are you going to be able to study? So like we saw with the list of words, vocabulary, right? We didn't write anything down. And so we didn't remember anything beyond just the vague impression of what we had read. The second type of note taker is somebody that copies down everything perfectly. They want to copy down everything in case they need it for later. They write down everything that was on the board, everything the professor says. They may even copy down paragraphs from their textbook. They over highlight everything because they want to really get the important stuff, and everything seems important. And with this type, we would say, if you write down everything, what are you going to study? How will you know what's most important? Thinking back to Kelly's activity, right? That is probably the only case where it might be useful to copy down everything, right? To copy it all down. And that's only if you're really allowed to use your notes on the exam or on the quiz. But if you're not, you just got a perfect copy of stuff that you're not able to really use. It's a lot more important to synthesize and process the information, which would lead to this third and final type of note taker, somebody that takes purposeful notes, somebody that is changing their note-taking format depending on the class. They are thinking or listening first with the material and then stopping to write. They're not writing down everything. They're not writing down 0. They are kind of meeting somewhere in the middle. And so I've got 3 types here. Of course, green would probably be the best, taking purposeful notes. You got the perfect copy, and then somebody that takes no notes at all, doesn't write anything down. If you guys would, I would love to hear where you would kind of rank yourself, at least the majority of the time. And so I'm gonna launch, I believe we have a poll for it, the note-taking style. If you are either no notes, perfect copy, purposeful notes, or maybe some combination. And I already see a couple people in the chat that have chimed in a little bit, so thank you. I'll read some of these out if you guys don't mind. It looks like Alma, hi Alma, writes too much. And I get that. That might be a little bit of the perfect copy, writing everything down. And a couple people agree. Mary, Cynthia, John, you all agree that you also maybe write too much. And it looks like Alma has identified herself as one of the people there. So thank you guys for that. Mary feels that they are a combo of writing too much but listening first. So kind of that, anxious, trying to copy everything down, which I totally get. Hey,
Yeah.
like we see.
So the ones that are writing down too much, is it certain types of classes, would y'all say?
It's pretty much across the board for me.
Okay. Oh. And then how about those of you that are writing down too much? Are you writing or are you typing?
I like paper better, so usually I'm writing it down.
Writing for me also.
A lot of writing in the chat as well.
And so when y'all are writing frantically to get everything down, do you feel like y'all are missing stuff like from the lecture?
I do. I feel like I miss a lot. I don't really take enough notes, I think.
Okay, so we can talk about strategies to maybe improve that note taking. Like Jordan's going to go into some more prepping for class, and then I'm going to go into some other, as we move forward through class and after class. So maybe ways to enhance that note taking. All right. So
Okay.
what was our final poll, Jordan?
It looks like in the poll, we have the majority of people do some combination of purposeful notes and a perfect copy. Nobody selected no notes at all, which I think is great. We've got people that are at least writing down something for some classes. But the minority take purposeful notes. Few people have identified as they're working their best, but most people either do a perfect copy, writing down everything, or some combination of both. Let me see, which is good. A couple more comments in the chat I'll read up before we move on that we want to make a note of. So some people will type in their PowerPoints. Neat. Keep that in mind. We'll talk a little bit more about the in-class strategies for active listening. Some people feel that they're missing things from the lecture. Blake feels that they usually write everything and try to focus on what they can't remember. They don't miss too much. Somebody does admit that they don't take notes during class. And then last one, Isabella feels sometimes I write too much and I miss parts of the lecture because I focus too much on writing. Very true. I think that's super important to note and to acknowledge. And what we want to talk about now, we want to talk a little bit more about how to use our purposeful notes. That's what we want to be. It's the kind of note taker we want to be. How we do that for our specific classes and the different strategies that we can use. And to do that, we're going to break down our classes into our before class strategies, stuff that we're going to do to prepare for class, stuff that we're doing during class, and the stuff that we do after class to make sure that we are fully exercising the best note-taking that we can. Oops, there we go. Okay, so to start off, we're going to talk a little bit about preparing for class, reading your textbook effectively, and preparing for lecture. And so for you guys, either in the chat or feel free to raise your hand or come off mute, how many of you guys have a class that uses a textbook?
I do.
Yes.
Thank you, John. Yes, a lot of yeses. A lot of me's, a lot of hands raised. Majority, I'd say the vast majority, have a class that uses a textbook. Now, how many of you guys, you don't have to answer this one, but think about it. How many of you guys have ever read the textbook for your class? Or conversely, how many of you have skipped reading the textbook chapter for the week, or have kind of just not touched a textbook for an entire course?
Yeah, that's me.
Yeah, probably so. Sometimes, yes, nursing school long chapters. I don't get to read all the assigned reading. Absolutely, I get that. And so yes, honestly, we can get it, right? Sometimes it's hard. Sometimes we have to skim, as Ariel says, and focus on certain parts. Because I get it. It's a time management deal, and it's tough. It's also kind of difficult to get through sometimes.
The textbook reading seems to drag on for me. Maybe I'm a slow reader, but it takes me hours to read one chapter.
Absolutely, John. I completely I can relate. I know exactly what you mean.
Yeah.
It can be very tough. And I think that that's something that we want to talk about, in terms of the usefulness of a textbook and why it's important. Because I think we all know that it's something that we should be doing. We kind of feel guilty when we don't do it, but we don't really know why. Like, why do we need to use a textbook if I have a lecture, if they're going to teach me in class, if I have homework? What's the point of the textbook? And so that's what this whole deal is about. The textbook we want to think of as the best way that we can prepare for class. Essentially, as a part of the learning process, you're going to want to interact with your material multiple times. Like, it's important for you to get the repetition down. And so we don't want to just go to class and see something for the first time and the last time, and that's it. That way, we're not going to expect to learn anything that way. We need to prepare for class and see the material for the first time, then go to class to kind of review and to start refining that information. And so here's a note-taking format that I want to highlight that is going to be the best way for us to go to class prepared to make the most out of it and to use our textbook most effectively. Has anyone here, yes or no, ever heard of Cornell Notes or used the Cornell Notes format for your classes?
Yeah, I've heard of it.
Awesome.
I've even tried using it. But the note-taking column, though, it seems to be so small, I don't get enough room to take notes, it seems like.
Totally. Absolutely. I get that. And that's important. You know, we want our note-taking format to be comfortable. We want it to be useful for us and to be able to capture the information that we want to record. Looks like a couple other people have heard of it. A lot haven't. Some have used it. Mixed results. But I want to talk about specifically the best way to use this for your textbook to prepare us for our course. This is going to be the best way to organize the material for our course. And so if you've never heard of Cornell Notes, or maybe it's been a while, I want to talk about the best way that I would use it. And so essentially, if you've never heard of it, you'll notice that this is a typical notebook paper page broken down into 3 different columns. That's going to be the biggest difference between Cornell Notes and just dumping everything on a blank piece of paper. You have a thin column on the left. It's like 2.5 inches wide. You have a bigger square over here on the right where you can kind of take bulk notes, as it's called. And then you have the summary block down at the bottom. And so the idea is to focus on this left column first, this Q column or questions column. And what we're doing over here is we're going to use our textbook to identify learning objectives, key terms, and concepts. That's where we're going to be starting when it comes to our note-taking process. So this is all very theoretical right now. We're going to look at a hands-on example in a second, but just keep that in mind, that we are going to use this Q column to identify what it is that we're supposed to be learning. We're going to use this big column on the right to write down those answers in our own words and to practice recording information to capture our notes. And then we're going to practice summarizing. We're going to use that bottom section down at the left to summarize information to make sure that we know what it is that we just learned today, this week, etc. And so let me pause for a second and look at some of the notes in the chat, and then I want to look at a textbook activity practice to start talking about how we can identify learning objectives. Let me see, a couple notes that I'll highlight from the chat. Some people feel that the textbook is kind of dry. Some people read section notes, but usually not the whole thing. They're kind of skimming. So maybe we can talk about how to figure out the best way to approach your textbook. Some people use the textbook as mainly for reference because it can be complicated and time consuming to go through the entire thing. And let me see, I'll highlight one chat from Maria that I think is really great. Sometimes I want to learn the things with exact words and concepts that the professor or textbook use instead of understanding the topic and make my own definitions. So it's great. I'm glad that we're all familiar with textbooks and that we are learning a new note-taking format. And so let's talk a little bit about this next piece here, identifying learning objectives. What we want to do, as we've looked at the Cornell Notes format, we want to take learning objectives from our textbook and to write them down over here in this left column over here, identifying learning objectives that can go into the questions column. For you guys, since you guys, most of you have used a textbook, you'll notice, and you can even check it right now if you have access to it, you'll notice at the beginning of each chapter of your textbook, you usually will have a list of learning objectives, a bulleted list of these are the things that you're going to be learning. And there are other places that we can check for it, for learning objectives, but that is typically where they're going to be for your textbook, at the beginning of that chapter. And here's an example of what that looks like. Here's kind of a activity here, right? Finding learning objectives. You'll notice that at the beginning of your chapter here, like this block, you will have a bulleted list of words or terms or definitions, something that you're supposed to be learning and walking away from your chapter. Has anybody seen that before? Has anyone noticed that about their textbook that they use?
I don't see it a lot in my textbook that I can remember.
Okay. And that happens too. I mean, hey, every class doesn't do it. Some of them don't. I've seen some textbooks that are very just basically a wall of text, and that's tough. But for sure, like Blake shared in the chat, some are at the end of the chapter or the bottom of the page. So they may be in different spots. They may not always be nice and neat at the beginning. But typically, if you're using a textbook, a college textbook, they will have some place where there's a learning objectives or review.
Yeah, and if they don't, another place to look is turning each section heading into a learning objective. So as you're going through, theoretically, the book's broken into sections. Those are kind of learning objectives as well.
Mhm. Oh, absolutely. Very true. So let's look at that, right? So here's a place to find learning objectives, beginning of the textbook chapter, for sure. There are other places we can look for, as Kelly mentioned, turning some of those section headings into learning objectives. And does everyone know what we mean by learning objectives? Essentially, an example of a sort of a goal, something that you're supposed to learn. Like here's from this chapter, it's about sleep wellness. And so the learning objectives for this chapter is to determine sleep need, discuss the benefits of napping, address pregnancy-related sleep challenges. It's something that you're supposed to learn and be able to, talk about confidently. So we can find them here at the beginning of the chapter. You may also find learning objectives in a PowerPoint. For you guys, I know most of you have your textbook for a class. For all of you, or for any of you, does your professor use a PowerPoint? Anyone have a class that uses a PowerPoint mainly for their classes?
Yes.
Yes, John, yes, absolutely. And John, I'll pick on you since I know that your mic works. Do you usually have access to the PowerPoint before class? Like, do they post it ahead of time?
Yes, right through the Blackboard.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, the Blackboard app has he'll post the PowerPoints and give us which chapters we need to read throughout the week.
That is excellent. That's wonderful. I'm imagining, John, if you don't have learning objectives if you don't have learning objectives at the beginning of your chapter textbook, I imagine that PowerPoint is going to be such a great resource for you to use to go through your PowerPoint before you start reading your chapter, to look at it and say, okay, here's some of the main takeaways, the summaries, the objectives. You're writing that. I'll look at that picture again. You're writing that basically in this left column over here in that question section is, let me look at my PowerPoint first and just note down some of the questions, learning objectives, the key takeaways for this. And as you're taking notes on that right column, you're using those objectives. Wonderful. Okay. Some other things that could be in the syllabus as well. Your syllabus for each week will have a topic essentially for that session that if you do have a scheduled lecture, that'll be in there. You may also just have some learning objectives within your syllabus that you can check in. You may also get a test review for your course, which is the best to get a test review, because that one for sure will have learning objectives for what you're supposed to know for your test. Anywhere else, etc. Has anyone noticed learning objectives or maybe some guided topics anywhere else for their courses that they might share as a good tip for other students?
Nothing.
Trying to explain the topic to anything. I mean, for example, your roommate, like, hey, can I explain you this? And then you know if you really understand the topic.
That is a great example. And Maria, I know Maria. I just met with Maria recently. Hey, Maria. I was going to say I know that name. Yes, that's a great example. Being able to teach the material. Think of your learning objectives as, if I were going to teach this to someone, what would I pull out and highlight? If I was going to teach somebody, for example, if I was going to teach somebody how to drive, road signs would be a learning objective, right? Knowing the road signs, or parallel parking, that would be a learning objective. Like if I was teaching someone to drive, if I was teaching somebody, how to solve inequalities, what would my learning objectives be? Probably the signs, less than, greater than, whatever, those things. Like I would think of, if I was teaching somebody this, what would I pull out? And that stuff, I have to go back again. You have to place in this left column is where that's going to go. And that's all we've done so far. So just to recap my section so far, all we've done is we've identified what are the learning objectives? What am I supposed to be learning? What am I going to get out of this lesson, this unit, this chapter? And I'm going to write that over here on this left column that I've made in my notes, just noting those objectives or coming up with my own, as Maria mentioned. We're going to talk about what to do with this stuff and how to kind of take notes over it, especially during class. But does anyone have any questions about just this first part, preparing for class by recording learning objectives? Okay, and feel free to leave them in the chat if you do think of one, because I'm going to go back to the chat at the end and we're going to go through every question you have. But for now, I'm going to kick it over to Kelly to talk about some of our during and after class strategies.
All right. So let's definitely just, highlight, like how Jordan had mentioned, you found your learning objectives. So if you do want to take notes from your textbook, that is a good way to get started to continue to prepare for class. You're not expected to understand everything from the get-go from that textbook. That's why we do go to class. That's why your professors offer a lecture. But the more you can create a general outline and a general structure for that information, the more effective your notes are going to be during class. So let's talk about coming prepared to class. So slide for me, Jordan, please. All right, so we come to class prepared. So hopefully you've at least skimmed your textbook. You've gone through, identified your learning objectives. You've taken some basic notes. And then now we want to come to class and we want to, have a general outline of what's going to happen during class. So if your professor does provide PowerPoints, having those actually printed, those 3 slides per page with some space to write, or 1 slide per page and some space to write, whatever works best for you. Getting that material. If you don't want to have the PowerPoints, maybe you want to have them on your computer screen and you want to write on another sheet of paper, that's fine too. And then we definitely want to make sure that we have all of those materials ready to go. If you guys have any other text or anything else that you need during class, please have that, be prepared. As you go through those learning objectives and as you start reading that textbook, you should start to come up with questions. There should be some areas that you need more focus in. And so you need to start kind of organizing those, jotting down some questions, maybe putting some emphasis on, hey, I didn't understand this from my textbook. I really need to make sure and listen to this during class and take good notes on this section. And then, definitely making sure that we kind of have a method to our madness with our notes. So there's a couple different strategies in terms of setting up that Cornell notes, like how Jordan mentioned, having that left-hand column with the learning objectives, and then having your bulk notes in that big column. Some students like to split that column in half and do lecture notes and textbook notes. Now I know John had mentioned that's kind of a limited space. So another option would be to go ahead and actually do it on 2 sides of your notebook. So if you have your notebook open, your learning objectives are on the 1 column, and then you're going to have your notes for your textbook and your notes from class. And so those are going to go coincide across that whole page. Another, way to think about it is if you want to just have those PowerPoints printed, keep them organized, put them in a binder, make sure you have that space. And then, like we said, have those questions, those additional information, so that you're prepared to come to class and ready to listen, so that you're listening for important information. You're not trying to, be those perfect copy where you're trying to write down everything your professor is saying. So that leads us into our active listening. Can anybody define active listening? Does anybody have an idea of what that might look like or what that word means?
Staying engaged while there's lecture.
Absolutely. All right. So let's talk about active listening. So next slide for me, Jordan. All right. So let's talk about that. So why do we take notes during class? To stay engaged. It helps us maintain our focus. As you're taking notes during class, you should be filling in any details. You shouldn't be trying to perfect copy. You shouldn't be trying to write down everything that is being said. Because at that point, how do you know what's important? If you're trying to write down so much information, your brain's not actually processing anything. You're just literally transcribing. And so at that point, that information's just on a sheet of paper. You haven't really processed it, encoded any of that information. So we definitely want to make sure that we are focusing on what's important. And some things to think about. Your professors, sometimes will straight up say, this is important. This is going to be on your test. Making note of that. If your professor kind of changes their tone of voice, so sometimes, they get really engaged or they, get really excited about something, odds on that's probably going to be something you need to know. Or they kind of highlight something over and over and over again. They're telling you that this is important by these little cues. Some of them are overt, where like, hey, this is important, and some of them are a little more subtle. So picking up on those cues is going to be important. So I will give you, research does show, now this was a pre-COVID research, but research does show that handwriting your notes is actually more effective because we cannot write as fast as we type. We type about 3 words to every 1 word we can write. So if you think about that, if you can type very quickly, you're literally more people that type are those perfect copiers. The people who handwrite are more of those purposeful notes because you can't write down everything. And so the more, like we said, we're prepared, we have that outline, we're only writing down what's important. We're only writing down the information that we need to improve our learning. And so ideally, we want to make sure that we have that space. So, leaving spaces, say you don't get everything written down during lecture, leaving a space, putting a question mark on there, making sure that you have that time to go back after class and maybe get connected with your professor or go back to your textbook. So it is important to take effective notes during class. It's not as important to get down everything. And so that way we are being more efficient and we're actually taking down notes that we need to be successful. So before we continue on, let's just kind of do a quick overview. Anybody want to share, what their class experience is like? Do they feel like they have to be a perfect copy? If maybe some of those science classes or anything in order to get all the information? Or do you feel like that's kind of just something that you feel like you need to do?
I think we got a hand up from Blake.
Yep.
Yeah, so I just kind of had like a quick question. When you're
Absolutely.
note taking, is it better to highlight like the process of the notes or like the technical aspect? And I'll clarify. So it's like when I'm taking history class notes, I don't necessarily need to remember all the dates. That's like the technical aspect. It's more of like the process of the events, right?
Mhm.
But in contrast to that, doing a math class, doing the process is slightly different than the technical aspect. So it's like, is there like a fusion of those things, or do I just kind of segment it for both of those classes how I feel? Because it's like sometimes like the math aspect of like writing down the notes and getting all the steps is what I need.
Mhm.
And then sometimes I need to do like just the like how the math works, I guess, is like the physical application of it.
Right. So I think the important thing to think about, especially with math, the first time you're seeing how to work a problem, I think it's important to get that technical component. As you move through the note-taking process, we can talk about what we would do after class and maybe how to further develop those notes into more meaningful information for yourselves. So right now, taking notes is important. You're engaging with the material. And so as we are going through, we want to make sure that we are getting the right important information. But as we continue through the study cycle and the study process, it's going to be more important about making those meaningful connections. So I think for math, for sure, it's important to get that technical component right, to start. And then as you start to practice those problems and study, we can talk about ways to maybe fine tune that strategy. Does that make sense?
Yes, that makes sense.
Okay. Any other questions?
I've got one in the chat that I think is a fantastic question from Jeremy. Is writing down everything while in class and then rewriting them at home in your own words a good idea?
Okay, so yeah, absolutely, Jeremy. We're going to talk about that moving forward. But what do you mean writing down everything? I mean, do you feel like you're able to actually capture everything during class? Do we have a no? Okay, so I think I if you're able to capture everything during class, I still think that you're missing out on some of the actual like connections in class. A lot of times, you know, taking the second to stop back and take that step back and process, as opposed to trying to write down everything. Because theoretically, if you come to class have created your learning objectives, have reviewed the textbook and the PowerPoint, there shouldn't be a need to write down everything, because at that point, as you're in class, you're really filling in that outline. You're fine tuning those details. You're not necessarily making sure that you have all of that information, because at that point you're not necessarily processing. And I feel like we need to make sure that we are that perfect copy. Remember, we said, how do we know what's important? So I think the answer is yes and no. If you feel like you're effective and getting down everything and reviewing after, then that's something that we can talk about, you know, as we talk about after class. But I think what we want to do is really make sure that we're fine tuning those notes during lecture. And then as we move through that study cycle, continuing to develop more strategies and skills.
I agree. I think that's a great point. And I'll highlight Mary. I think Mary has a similar kind of comment in that vein. Sometimes you can take photos or screenshots of diagrams, etc., to review later,
Yeah,
which
absolutely.
I think is fantastic. So I'd say yes to Mary and I think Jeremy's question. I love that idea of reviewing later, and Kelly's going to talk more about that. Essentially, you know, the bottom line, we want your in-class experience, if you do have a lecture, to not be stressful. We do not want you feeling like, oh my God, I have to write so fast and copy down every single thing, or else I'm going to not get it, because that's stressful. So you want to prepare, you want to go to class and use those active listening strategies to just, you know, focus on what's important, staying engaged. And yes, it's a fantastic idea, and it's actually a necessity to go back to that to review and to try to whittle it down into something a little bit more refined after class.
So let's talk about that. Let's talk about reviewing after class. So next slide for me, Jordan, please. All right, let's talk about that. So why do we review after class? So I'm going to give you all some little stats. Don't let them scare you, because we're going to talk about some strategies to be effective without, you know, overcoming some of these stats. So research does show you forget about 50% of what you hear in lecture. So don't be afraid. Don't make that sound like you have to be the perfect copier. We're going to talk about how to be more effective with our notes so that you aren't losing that information. And then research does show that you forget about that you are unable to remember 95% of the information you don't write down. So then that also leads back to why we're writing down what's the most important. And then we're going to go back and we're going to refine those notes moving forward. So don't let this scare you. I think these are just numbers that are going to throw it out there. But I think once we talk through some of the next steps of the study cycle, and how to be more effective with your reviewing and create component, that those numbers are going to be less intimidating. All right, so let's talk about reviewing. All right, so why, you know, what is this review component? So Jordan had mentioned the Cornell Notes. So if you are using our Cornell Notes option, you have your learning objectives on the left-hand side, you have your notes in the middle, and then underneath is a summary. And that summary is going to be in your own words. Sitting down right after class, you know, because we do forget, sitting down right after class, processing what you just learned, highlighting some important information, going back through those notes as you're going through to write that summary. You know, taking notes. Did I, this is going to be really important, or the professor said this was on the exam, or hey, there's a really good diagram of this in my book on this page. So really kind of taking that step back and actually almost annotating your notes, making sure that if you have any questions, you have options. You can go to office hours. You can go to a classmate. You can go back to your textbook. You can go back to the PowerPoint. You can go to tutoring. So you have lots of options to fill in those gaps. So if they're there, it's not a big deal. We can go back and find that information. And so after we go through those notes, we kind of summarize. It's going to be important to answer any of those questions that we maybe had, go back through those learning objectives, start processing that information. And now we're going to talk about why we review our notes. So we've reviewed our notes, and at this point, a lot of those notes are from the textbook, they're from lecture. They're probably in your own words, they might be in your shorthand, but they're not really in your own words yet. They're from your textbook, they're from your professor. So now it's time to take that information, and we want to establish our own study aids. We want to take that information and practice. We want to organize it into a new format. We want to start developing connections. So this is really a chance for you to think about, how are you going to learn this information? If we just sit down and we've read our textbook, we've taken notes in class, and we do nothing else with them. Maybe we just reread our notes, or maybe we just reread the textbook. That's what we call being a passive learner. And that's not really an effective way to learn material and retain material. I'm not going to say that no students can do that. Some students have fabulous memories, and they can read and retain that information like that. And you know what, more power to you if that's you. I would say about 95% of us are not that way.
I wish I could do that.
Yeah, right. You hear about the photographic memory, or you hear about the people that have a memory of an elephant. That's great. And if that is the student and that's working for them, more power to you. But those of you who are here, I'm guessing that's not you. So we want to talk about how to be more effective with those notes. And so I'm going to ask Jordan to drop a poll for me. And we're going to talk about, what kind of study aids do you use? How do you take those notes from your textbook and from class and put them into a new format? How do you reorganize them? How do you study from your notes?
You guys, flashcards.
And you can pick multiple options, but maybe pick like your top 2 choices, or maybe if you use a couple different ones for different classes.
We are getting a great mix so far. It is like
all over the board. I see that.
A lot of flashcards.
Okay. So y'all use old school flashcards, not Quizlet? I like it.
Oh, we have both options. That's cool.
Okay. Yeah, I figured I wanted to see old school and new school.
Versus Quizlet, yeah. Those are neat. And I'll add just one in the chat. Maria, I believe, adds that they just mostly reread it after they take the notes as their study aid.
Okay. And, like I said, if that works for you and you're able to retain the information, great. But let's talk about, why do we want to do this next step? So let's go ahead and go to that next slide. And let's just kind of highlight some of these study aids that we talked about. So a lot of you guys did mention quite a few. There was a good number of you that do flashcards, which is a great tool, spending the time to make the flashcards. Now, sometimes students spend more time making their Quizlet and making their flashcards and not actually using them effectively. So we want to talk about why we're going to use that. So Quizlet, flashcards, those are more for that retention, that recall component. So if you do have definitions or, different information that you need to recall pretty close to, what it is from the textbook or what it is from lecture, I think these are great tools to use. Quizlet, you can also kind of adapt it to maybe some of those more analytical questions. But I think, flashcards and things like that, definitely kind of lend themselves more towards that. This Cornell Notes is basically creating a study guide. You have those learning objective questions. So that might be something to do. Some students like to kind of retype their notes after class, which I think that's a great method, but what I would encourage you to do is maybe reorganize it. Maybe put it into like sections like, okay, here's my key terms. Here are some meaningful combos. Here's some connections. So this is how this is connected. One of the things I like to do with my math students for Blake it's a 3-column note. So basically on your left-hand column is going to be your key terms or your objective or whatever your concept is. So say you're doing the slope of a line. Then your middle column would be actually defining that, writing out the equation, maybe drawing an image. And maybe there's multiple formulas. So you could have like point slope formula, you could have like the 2 coordinates. And then that third column would be an example. So you're taking notes in class, you're writing down the examples as the professor's working it. But after, you're going to take that information and you're going to sit down and try to make those connections, process it, understand it, so that when you see it on a test, whatever format it comes in, you're taking the time to really make sure that you understand it backwards and forwards. And you could easily pick out that, oh yeah, this is the point slope formula. I need this and this to solve this equation. For your anatomy and physiology, I know, and some of those science classes, a lot of my students like to use flowcharts, graphic organizers, mind maps. So that way you can kind of show how, this leads to this, and this is connected to this. So it's an easy way to kind of get a lot of information into one space and get it reorganized, and making those connections to yourself. So shortening that information. Ideally, as we're making our own study aids, we're condensing that information down into its meaningful components. We're not necessarily trying to rewrite everything. Because at that point, you're still being a passive learner. You're not actively engaging with the material and taking it and making it your own. So we've kind of talked about Quizlet, flashcards, outlining. Is there any of the other tools that students use? We didn't talk about study guides, like Jordan had mentioned. A study guide is a great tool. You can use that as like a self-test piece. You can use that to change that into questions. And so ideally, what I like to challenge my students to do is for the study guides, put the question onto a note card, the small note cards, not those big ones, and try on the back to get like the 3 or 4 most important pieces of information that will help you answer that question. Maybe it's an image, maybe it's a key term, but we want to make sure that if we see that key term, we can answer that learning objective question and take that information that we've condensed down to this small piece and expand it back out to the most broad information that we might need for the exam. So those are just a quick overview of different study aids. We got about 10 minutes, so I definitely want to get you guys to come off mute and chat and see what's going on, what you have questions about, so that we definitely make sure that this workshop is meaningful to you.
Looks like we have our first question from Maria with her hand up.
Yeah, hi everyone, and thank you. I'm more the kind of person that learns with, like, not in a paper, like, like using more sense, not only the eyes. So do you have any other like kind of tools that I can use for that?
Yeah. So research does show actually reciting words out loud helps with memory. Like I think you had mentioned explaining it to a roommate. That's really helpful. Drawing images, like, maybe not necessarily like, so maybe something like that mind mapping where you're just maybe doing 1 or 2 words, but you're showing how it's connected. Jordan, you got any other ones for us?
I think those are great for sure. And I get that seeing it necessarily may not be the best way for you to learn. That is very true for a lot of people. You have to do something with that material. So I would encourage everybody, even if you are like a more visual learner and you like to see the visual connections in a mind map, or you like to see the outline, the creation of the material is the most important part. So it's not necessarily about the thing that you end up with. Like seeing your notes like that may not be helpful, but putting them like that is what's helpful. Organizing them, reviewing them, writing it out, doing something with it is the part that's going to be most helpful. But yeah, and like Kelly said, talking about it out loud, explaining it to someone else, I think are great techniques.
Right. Thank you.
Of course. Let me see. We got a couple more hands up. I'll do those first, and then a couple questions on the chat. It looks like the next one I think was from Ramona.
So my question is, I try to take notes when I'm reading the books. So for books that are like really heavy and dense, I feel like I'm trying to take notes, and yeah, it's hard for me to decide what is important or like good way to take notes from what you're reading. If you have any tips for that, specifically for like nursing or like medical type of material.
Absolutely. So a good way to kind of get started with that, like Jordan said, looking at the learning objectives. If your book has a chapter summary or a chapter review, that's another good place to start, because that's telling you kind of a brief outline of what is important from this chapter. So keeping that outline open, maybe trying not to write down so much and then filling in those gaps from lecture. Let's see, what are some other good strategies? Jordan, you got some strategies for dense textbooks?
I would say, yeah, for textbooks, I know that the our instinct is usually, as we talked about when it comes to note taking for textbooks, is to write down a lot,
or highlight, yeah,
or to highlight a lot. Especially if it's a physical textbook or even those cool ebooks you can highlight.
Yeah.
So I know our tendency is to just kind of take notes as we go and write down a bunch of stuff. That is not a bad thing, keeps us alert, it's fine. But I think what could be better if you do have a longer textbook, as strange as it may feel, my recommendation would be to read first, like a couple of paragraphs, even up to a page or an entire section, without writing down anything. Just read it, focus on, I'm just going to read this and pay attention, focus for as long as I can before my attention starts to drift, and then I'm going to pause, go back, and then write stuff down of like, okay, what did I just read?
Yeah.
What stood out as important to me now that I've read an entire section? Because I think you'll notice when you get that more bird's eye view and you're not like, oh, let me write down something for every sentence, every paragraph, I should write down something. When you get that bigger perspective of, okay, I've read a section, I've read a page, you'll notice what stands out as an actual learning objective versus just like extra detail or an example. And so like you'll notice you're still reading the entire thing. We want you to read the entire chapter, but you read it and your notes should only reflect the most important takeaways from that chunk. So read first, then pause to go back and review it to write down, take like a couple minutes to write down.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thank you. That makes sense.
Good. Okay. I think was there another person that had a hand up that wanted to share audibly, that wanted to talk for a second?
And Jordan, can we post the survey in the chat for those if you have to leave at 4, we have a quick survey. If y'all could do this, I will send it to you guys again when we're done, plus a copy of this presentation. So y'all have access to all of this again. But if you can take a few seconds, it's a really quick survey, we would appreciate it. So we know how to better improve this workshop moving forward.
So let me post the survey in the chat, in the chat, and then I'm gonna check the chat and see what other questions.
Is there any other questions that we need?
Okay, I'm posting the survey now. It looks like in the chat, I'll go back and read a few of these. Okay, okay, helpful. There's a good question from Natalie. Would it be helpful to invest in an iPad to take notes, or is writing the notes with pen and paper better? I will hear I'll hear Kelly's perspective, but I would say, honestly, I don't have an iPad. I've never used an iPad for taking notes. I have only used pen and paper. Works fine for me. I would never tell a student that they need to spend money in order to learn better. I feel like that's never my takeaway. But
I'm not gonna say go buy an iPad because you can check one out from ACC.
That is also very true. Yes, there's a happy middle ground.
So there is, but it's ACC's iPad, so you can't necessarily download. You can usually use like free apps and stuff on there, but if you don't want to download something that you pay for, because they will, technically I guess it's still that app would belong to you, but what I find that students use the iPad Sometimes they use it effectively. Other times they're almost using it as a tab or like a computer. And so they're still kind of highlighting everything or trying to write down a lot more than really they need to. But there are some classes where I've seen it, like a lot of my students that are in nursing, I've seen it used very effectively. So I think if you're using it effectively, then I think that is worth it. So if you wanted to, connect with a coach and maybe talk about your note-taking style for specifically on using the iPad, I would say, definitely get connected.
We got a question in the chat from Ramona. Where can you check out an iPad? That's going to be from Student Technology Services, and we can include that info.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll include that info or I'll send it to Kelly and she can put it in the email. Basically, you fill out this. I was trying to find it really quick. It's like a Google
They moved
form.
the form. It's hard to find now.
Yeah, I'll dig it up, but we'll
Yeah.
put that in the email if you'd like to check out an iPad. You basically sign up, you schedule a time to go and pick it up from the Highland campus.
You would pick it up from the Highland campus. Yeah.
Okay, there was one other question. Feel free to keep chatting, guys. This one I wanted to find because it was interesting, and I just hadn't called on this person before. I just missed it. Who was it? Just saw it. From Isabella. So essentially Isabella's question is it better, or is it always better to read the key takeaways first and then to start taking notes on my own?
Yes.
And I would say yes. Yeah, absolutely.
Yes, that's a really great way because, the same way that we have the basic outline for going to class when getting preparing before you start reading is important. So if you know what you're looking for, if you know those key takeaways, reading your chapter summary, looking at those chapter reviews before you even jump into that textbook is a really great way to make sure that you're looking for what's important, right? Somebody has spent the time to give you an outline of what they think you need to get from this material. So the more you can, prime your brain to look for that, the better your focus is going to be and the more effective those notes are going to be.
Yeah. See, we got like another minute or so. We can always hang around a little after, but
yeah, if anybody wants to come.
Yeah, any other questions or anybody just want to share anything that's been helpful for them?
Well, the PowerPoints from the class that the professor posts on Blackboard, they seem to be outlines of the class of the chapter for that week. So they make good study guides, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
They have the key points and the key terms, and so
yeah. Now, again, that's information in somebody else's words. So we definitely want to take that and make sure that we are, doing something more with that, not just using that, because that's, being that passive learner. We want to actively engage with that. So using it as the tool, but you still need to really engage with that material.
Okay.
To help you with that retention and that memory.
So just highlighting key terms and maybe reformulating them into question and answer.
Absolutely. It's a great way to repurpose those notes into something that is a study aid for you.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Absolutely. And I think the chat is all clear.
Yeah. So if you guys have questions, so we kind of did a broad overview, but if you have questions and you want to bring a textbook and you want to learn how to set up Cornell Notes, or you want to learn how to create a study aid, definitely connect with an academic coach. You can work one-on-one with them. Because this is just kind of broad information. And so really the point of academic coaching is to personalize those study habits for you.
Mm-hmm.
So definitely get connected with us and we can work one-on-one to figure out what's the best strategy, what's the best study aid, what's the best textbook reading method that will really help fine tune that information so that you are getting the most out of those notes.
Okay, and we can just find a study coach, go by the Learning Lab, say, at any of the campuses. Is that?
Let me pull up our.
So academic coaching is available at Round Rock, San Gabriel, Highland, and Rio, and then we're available virtually 6 days a week. So you can schedule an appointment with any coach and figure out, if they're, not on your campus, the best way is to meet with them virtually. And you can set that up on our website. We do have a link, and when I send you the information, the PowerPoint and the survey and some resources like the study, how to check out on iPad and all of that, I'll also make sure and include the link for coaching.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, please do. We'd love to meet with you guys individually. I think that's the best way to do it, to talk one-on-one about your classes that you're specifically taking.
All right.
But yeah, so wonderful.
Do you
Join
have
us
any
for our
other
next
questions?
workshop.
Yeah, when we didn't plug it.
I was gonna say,
Go ahead, Jordan.
it's Tuesday, October 4th, and it's not me presenting, I don't think.
Nope.
No,
Nope,
it's not.
Nancy and Celeste.
Nancy and Celeste.
So the first time we haven't done test prep.
I know. Yeah, usually it's me and Kelly presenting.
Yeah. So it'll be interesting to see a new perspective. So you'll
Yes.
see two new coaches. We all have the same information, but we all come about it a little bit different. So it'll be interesting to kind of see how they take all those study aids that you've made and how to study for those upcoming exams.
Yeah.
Okay. Is that a virtual thing?
Yes,
like
all of our workshops are virtual.
Yes. And
Is
we'll
there,
put the next RSVP. I think Kelly will send the next
Yep.
RSVP form in the email. Okay.
And
there
if you lose it, you can always find it on our website, our workshop. We have a link to our workshop page on our website.
Oh, okay. Cool.
Yep.
Yeah.
All right.
Wonderful. And
is
then
there
Rebecca-
any way to access the one from before? I know there was a part before this one.
the
So
time management one?
yes, so we don't have one. There was not a recording, there was a goof, but we actually will be running it again in October. But we also do have old recordings from other time management workshops that we've done. They're all very similar. And then also we have a lot of our time management resources. That's probably one of our most utilized resource. So we do have quite a bit of information about time management on our website.
Okay.
But if you wanted to connect with a coach, Samantha and I and Jordan have all done the time management one repeatedly. So if you wanted to connect with a coach, we could walk you through a lot of the information as well.
I was looking at that beforehand. I think I'm going to meet with Jordan. He's at my campus here in San
Perfect.
Gabriel, correct?
Oh,
There
that's
you go.
wonderful. Yes, I am. I'm here now at the San Gabriel campus. It's a
Yeah.
beautiful spot. So yeah, that would be wonderful. I'd love to do an in-person appointment.
All right, sounds good. I'll actually be there tomorrow. I think the bash is tomorrow, so I'll be there
Yep.
for that as well. So,
Okay. Yes,
Yeah.
that's true. Yeah, maybe I'll
Yep.
see you then.
Absolutely.
all right, well, thank you guys for the presentation. I'm going to head out myself. This was a
Yep.
great time. I appreciate all the information.
Yeah, thank you for coming and
all.
participating. We really enjoy a good group that likes to get the most out of all of our workshops. So
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you.
So,
Yeah.
You're
Y'all have a good
welcome.
one.
thanks for coming. We
Sure.
really appreciate y'all being
Rebecca
such a
in the
good group.
chat. Let me see. Rebecca in the chat. Yes, a recording will be available of this workshop. We would be happy to provide. We recorded it. I don't think it'll be
Yeah.
on YouTube, so it won't be
Not yet.
captioned.
Yeah, so we can provide it without captions, individually, but it will be posted on our website as well once it gets
Yes.
captioned.
And to Maria Phillips, yes, we can definitely add the Cornell Notes guide to the email to you all.
It
No
is on
problem.
there.
Yes.
It's
Oh,
on our
okay.
it's on our resource page. So
It
we have a
is there.
page at the very end of our presentation with all
Oh
of your
yeah,
resources.
we do. I forgot. Yeah, we have
So
that.
and those will all have links. So you guys will have links to all of our
Yeah,
resources.
you'll get the whole presentation, so you'll just flip to the last page and you'll find it.
All right.
Okay.
So,
All right. Well, thank you all for joining us.
I'll post the survey one more time if you haven't done it,
Yes.
please.
Yes, please. The more information we get, the better our presentations get.
oh,
All right.
textbook reading tips.
All right, I'm going to cut the recording now.
Thank you. Thank you.